Northern Montana Territory, November 1878. While most frontier trappers were frantically reinforcing their log cabins with fresh clay chinking and stockpiling endless cords of wood for the brutal winter ahead, an old trapper named Abselum Winters was doing something that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching from the valley below. He was digging down into the frozen hillside instead of building up. His neighbors, seasoned woodsmen who had spent years fighting the brutal mountain elements, were convinced the old man had lost his mind. Everyone on the frontier knew that surviving a northern Montana winter demanded thick pine walls, a massive stone hearth, and mountains of firewood stacked shoulder high. Yet here was Winters, a solitary man well into his 60s, excavating deep into the packed earth like a badger preparing for hibernation. He worked with tools and methods that looked far more fitting for a root cellar or a burial mound than a human home. What these skeptical builders failed to realize was that Abselum Winters understood a fundamental truth about thermal physics that most frontier carpenters had completely missed. He possessed a piece of forgotten engineering knowledge so extraordinarily effective that it would keep him comfortable through temperatures cold enough to shatter pine logs, freeze whiskey solid inside a sealed bottle, and kill healthy livestock in their pens. Before we uncover the brilliant physics behind his lost construction method, take a moment to hit that subscribe button for our channel right now. On this channel, we dig deep into lost frontier wisdom, forgotten engineering, and historical survival strategies that could save your life if modern power grids and infrastructure ever collapse. Every single story brings you real, battle-tested techniques from an era when failing to understand nature meant an early grave. Subscribe today and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from and what the coldest winter temperature you have ever personally experienced was. Now, let us return to 1878 and discover what this old hunter knew that everyone else had forgotten. Abselum Winters had arrived in the northern Montana Territory in late autumn of 1876, trailing the dying embers of the western fur trade boom. Unlike the younger trappers who automatically cleared timber down in the river valleys near water sources, Winters selected a south-facing slope 3 miles up Tenderfoot Creek. It was an uncompromising location where the Arctic gales hit hardest and snow drifted deep enough to bury horses. His initial choices baffled every experienced frontiersman in the region. Instead of felling towering lodgepole pines to notch together a traditional cabin, he began digging directly into the hard hillside. Over the course of 3 painstaking weeks, working alone with a heavy pick, an iron shovel, and a wooden wheelbarrow, he removed approximately 480 cubic feet of earth and dense clay. The local metis trappers who watched from a distance simply shook their heads. Even the Blackfeet trading parties that occasionally passed through the trading post looked at his deep trench with silent confusion. By late October, Winters had carved out a structure that looked less like a home and more like a cave with a low, crude stone facade. The excavation measured 12 feet deep into the slope, 10 feet wide across the front, and 7 feet high at its deepest interior wall. The front timber and stone wall, which was the only part of the shelter exposed to the open sky, stood barely 4 feet high. It was constructed from heavy river stones mortared with a mixture of yellow clay and dried prairie grass. Dutch Henry, an influential builder in the territory who had personally constructed over 40 conventional log cabins, stopped by in early November to examine the work. He looked down into the dark excavation and offered condescending advice that Winters politely ignored. Dutch Henry told everyone at the trading post that the old man was digging his own tomb, predicting that the hole would collect cold air like water in a wooden bucket and leave him frozen solid long before Christmas. The local skepticism turned to outright mockery when Winters installed his heating apparatus. Standard frontier cabins featured massive fireplaces built from river rocks, boasting open hearths 4 feet wide that devoured enormous logs. Winters did the exact opposite. He constructed a tiny, precise stone firebox, measuring just 18 inches across. He placed it not in the center of the space, but offset to the left side, barely 14 inches away from the raw earth wall at the rear. The chimney, built from carefully fitted sandstone blocks, did not shoot straight up through the roof as any ordinary builder would design it. Instead, it ran along the interior back wall before exiting through the thick earth above. Dutch Henry publicly declared the design a suicide pact, arguing that a firebox that small could not warm a chicken coop and that placing it against the back wall would simply drain all the heat directly into the frozen mud. What the local settlement failed to grasp was that Abselum Winters had not invented this method on the spot. He had learned the principles 30 years earlier while working in the copper mines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. There, Finnish immigrant miners had shown him how their Scandinavian ancestors survived winters far more brutal than anything seen in the lower territories. He had also observed similar concepts during a bitter season spent among a Cree hunting band in Saskatchewan, where earth-sheltered lodges maintained safe, stable warmth, while timber cabins froze through. Winters knew that size and brute force were the enemies of winter survival. He worked quietly, carefully angling his firebox bricks, selecting specific types of dense sandstone for thermal absorption, and maintaining a calm confidence that his neighbors mistook for senility. To understand why the frontier settlers were so profoundly wrong, one must examine the severe thermal flaws inherent in standard 19th-century log cabins. The average frontier cabin was a monument to brute material consumption rather than smart engineering. Settlers built tall timber walls above ground, exposing thousands of square feet of surface area to howling sub-zero winds. As cold winds swept across the exterior logs, it constantly stripped away heat through conduction. The chinking between logs, usually a mixture of mud, hair, and moss, dried out, cracked, and created hundreds of microscopic gaps. These gaps allowed freezing drafts to penetrate the interior, forcing heated air out through the roof in a continuous, wasteful convection cycle. Furthermore, traditional frontier fireplaces were notoriously inefficient. An open hearth acts as a powerful vacuum. As a massive fire roars in the fireplace, it pulls huge volumes of air out of the cabin interior and shoots it up the wide chimney flue. To replace that air, icy outside draft is sucked inward through every tiny crack in the log walls and floorboards. Settlers were caught in a vicious loop. The bigger they built their fires to stay warm, the faster their fireplaces sucked cold Arctic air into the far corners of their homes. It was not uncommon for a family huddled 2 feet from a roaring hearth to roast their faces, while the water bucket sitting on a table 10 feet behind them froze solid. Abselum Winters engineered his earth-sheltered structure to eliminate every single one of these physical vulnerabilities. The technical specifications of his dugout revealed a deep understanding of natural thermodynamics. His choice to excavate 12 feet into the hillside was based on a fundamental physical property of the earth. At that depth beneath the surface, the ground temperature remains stable year-round, hovering between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of whether the air above is 90 degrees in July or 30 below zero in January. While 45 degrees Fahrenheit requires a small heat source to make a room comfortable for living, it represents an incredible thermal baseline. Instead of fighting against an exterior temperature of 30 below zero, Winters was starting his heating process from a baseline of 45 degrees above zero. He had effectively wrapped 3 sides and the top of his living room in a massive, earth-drawn thermal blanket that could never freeze. By keeping the front wall low just 4 feet above the external ground level and sloping the roof down from 7 feet at the rear to meet it, Winters minimized the total surface area exposed to wind chill. His entire shelter contained roughly 840 cubic feet of interior airspace. In comparison, a standard 12 by 14-foot frontier cabin contained between 1,400 and 1,600 cubic feet of air that needed to be continuously heated. By reducing the interior volume by nearly half, he dramatically reduced the fuel required to achieve a comfortable ambient temperature. The real masterpiece of his design, however, was his thermal mass battery. Behind and surrounding his small 18-inch firebox, Winters had gathered and laid over 2,800 pounds of carefully selected dense sandstone. He deliberately avoided limestone, which fractures under thermal stress, and river rocks, which harbor internal moisture that can explode violently when exposed to intense heat. Sandstone possesses exceptional thermal retention capacity and structural stability under repeated heating cycles. These heavy stones extended 18 inches back into the earth wall and projected 8 inches outward into his living quarters. The combustion chamber itself was lined with dense fire brick that he had hauled 60 miles from Helena. This heavy firebox allowed him to create hot, fast fires that reached combustion temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, burning fuel with near total efficiency, while the exterior stone mass slowly absorbed the heat. His chimney was engineered with equal precision. Rather than building a straight vertical pipe that allowed hot smoke and heat to escape directly into the night sky, Winters constructed a serpentine smoke path winding through the sandstone heat storage mass. Smoke from the firebox was forced to travel nearly 6 feet horizontally and diagonally through the dense stone before finally rising out of the earthen roof. This lengthened flue path allowed the sandstone to absorb approximately 73% of the heat energy contained in the exhaust gases. In stark contrast, a standard straight-shaft cabin fireplace captured only 20 to 30% of the heat produced by its fuel, venting the remaining 70 to 80% uselessly out the top of the chimney. When Samuel Grant, an experienced frontier mason who had built hearths across 3 territories, inspected the chimney design in late November, he declared it unworkable. He predicted that the draft would fail, filling the underground space with lethal smoke and suffocating the old trapper in his sleep. What Grant did not understand was flue mechanics. Winters had calculated his flue cross-section at precisely 28 square inches. This was sized slightly larger than necessary for the firebox volume, generating strong draft pressure that easily pulled smoke through the serpentine turns while transferring maximum heat into the surrounding stone mass. Every detail of the floor was built to prevent heat loss and dampness. Winters laid down 8 inches of dry river sand, topped with flat river stones fitted together like a tight cobblestone street. This created additional thermal mass directly underfoot, while breaking the capillary action that usually draws dampness up from wet soil. Around the perimeter of the floor, he dug a shallow drainage channel leading to a rock-filled sump, ensuring that ground moisture would never pool inside his living space. His entrance door was built like a heavy vault. Instead of a single layer of pine boards, Winters built a door using 2 separate layers of split logs, sandwiched around a core of compressed dry prairie grass. The door was hung on thick leather hinges and sealed against a custom stone frame using a clay and fiber gasket. The finished door was 4½ inches thick, offering more than double the insulation value of a conventional cabin door. By the 1st of December, as the cold winds began to howl across the territory, Abselum Winters had completed his work. To the average settler riding past, the structure looked like nothing more than a crude dirt mound sticking out of the snow. In reality, he had constructed an advanced passive thermal battery, a self-regulating living space, capable of storing massive amounts of heat energy and maintaining comfortable temperatures with a tiny fraction of the fuel required by his neighbors. On the 3rd of December, as the ambient outside temperature dropped to 8 degrees above zero, Dutch Henry rode past the hillside on his horse. Seeing a light wisp of smoke rising from the earthen mound, he shook his head in pity, remarking to his riding companion that the old fool would be found frozen solid within 2 weeks. Inside the dugout, Abselum Winters was sitting comfortably in his shirt sleeves, enjoying a warm meal, while his small sandstone firebox quietly charged thousands of pounds of stone with heat that would radiate through the cold mountain night. The true test of the old trapper's creation arrived on December 18, 1878. The morning began with an eerie, suffocating silence across northern Montana. At dawn, the mercury read 14 degrees above zero, but veteran frontiersmen knew that a catastrophe was coming. The sky to the northwest bore a sinister yellowish color, the air was dead calm, and the barometric pressure dropped so rapidly that men felt their ears pop and old joint injuries ache. By noon, the Arctic outbreak struck with terrifying force. The Blackfeet called such weather the White Death. Modern meteorologists would classify it as an extreme Arctic outbreak. Winds instantly surged past 40 miles per hour, driving dense snow horizontally and dropping visibility to absolute zero. The temperature plummeted like a stone, dropping past zero, past -10, and racing toward extreme depths. In those conditions, a man caught outdoors could freeze to death in the 3 minutes it took to walk from his cabin door to his woodshed. Down in the valley near Tenderfoot Creek, the settlement went into emergency survival mode. Families gathered inside their log homes, stoking their giant stone fireplaces until the hearths glowed red. They fed huge pine logs into the flames hour after hour. Dutch Henry's cabin, widely considered the finest timber home in the region, consumed almost 1/2 cord of seasoned firewood in the first 24 hours simply to keep the temperature around the hearth at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. In the far corners of his cabin, just 12 feet away from the roaring fire, frost formed thick white patterns along the interior walls, and water inside tin cups froze solid. By December 20th, the storm reached its peak. The outside air temperature fell to 18 degrees below zero, driven by relentless gusts that drove snow through the smallest gaps in cabin walls. Families in the valley were forced to merge households, piling blankets together and sharing body heat to survive the bitter night. Wood consumption became a desperate crisis. Dutch Henry realized he was burning wood 4 times faster than his winter calculations had accounted for, threatening to exhaust his fuel supply before the storm even cleared. Up on the snow-covered hillside, visible only as a small white mound with a solitary stream of smoke, Abselum Winters sat inside his earth shelter. On December 21st, Samuel Grant, genuinely concerned that the old trapper had died, made a dangerous trek up the mountain through hip-deep snowdrifts. Grant carried a heavy axe, expecting to dig out a frozen body or find a desperate man burning his own wooden furniture to stay alive. When Grant finally cleared the snow away from the heavy door and pushed it open, he stopped dead in his tracks. The scene inside was so utterly unexpected that he later described it in letters to his family, with a mixture of shock and total disbelief. Samuel Grant stepped through the heavy, insulated door of the earth shelter, bracing himself for the gloom of a cold subterranean grave. Instead, he was hit by a sudden, enveloping wave of dry, gentle heat that forced him to pull off his thick beaverskin mittens within seconds. Mind you, Grant was a hardened frontier mason who had spent decades living in cold climates, but what he witnessed inside that small dugout made him question everything he thought he knew about shelter construction. Abselum Winters was sitting calmly on a hand-carved stool near the back wall, dressed in nothing more than a light cotton shirt and denim trousers. He was whistling quietly while stirring a bubbling pot of venison stew on a small iron plate fitted to the top of his firebox. Grant reached into his heavy wool coat and pulled out a brass-cased mercury thermometer that his brother, a practicing physician in St. Louis, had gifted him years earlier. He hung the instrument from a wooden peg on the wall, stepped back, and waited. When the mercury stabilized, Grant leaned in closer to read the glass tube. The interior ambient temperature registered at an astounding 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the howling Arctic wind was driving the wind chill down to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. But inside this earthen haven, the air felt like a mild afternoon in late spring. Make no mistake, there was no roaring bonfire blazing inside the shelter. The tiny 18-inch firebox held a flame no larger than what a camp cook would use to boil a pot of coffee. It was consuming a fraction of a single pine branch, using perhaps 1/8 of the timber that Dutch Henry was burning every hour down in the valley. Yet the air throughout the entire 840 cubic foot space felt uniformly warm from wall to wall. There were no drafty spots, no icy corners, and no smoke hanging in the room. Puzzled by where this immense warmth was coming from, Grant walked to the back of the room and placed his bare hand against the smooth sandstone mass stacked behind the firebox. He jerked his fingers back instantly with a sharp gasp. The heavy stones were so intensely hot that he could barely touch them for more than a second. For 3 straight days, while the Arctic storm raged outside, the small, clean-burning fire had been steadily charging over 2,800 pounds of dense sandstone with thermal energy. The stones had acted like a giant sponge, soaking up heat from the burning wood and the serpentine chimney pipe, and now they were radiating that stored power evenly into the living quarters. Winters smiled softly at the mason's astonishment, and explained the simple reality of his situation. He told Grant that he only burned 3 or 4 small sticks of wood every 6 hours to keep the stone battery fully charged. Truth be told, even if he allowed the fire to die out completely, the interior temperature dropped by only 2 degrees every hour, eventually leveling off at 52 degrees Fahrenheit due to the surrounding earth insulation. While Dutch Henry and the valley settlers were waking up 3 times every night to shove massive logs into their dying hearths, Abselum Winters was sleeping soundly through 8 unbroken hours of sleep, waking up to a room that remained comfortably above 60 degrees Fahrenheit without touching a single stick of wood. Grant stood in the center of the room, doing the mental math with absolute disbelief. Outside, the atmospheric temperature sat at 18 degrees below zero, with sustained 30-mile-per-hour winds. Winters was maintaining a 76-degree temperature differential between the outdoors and his living quarters, while using roughly 12% of the fuel consumed by a standard frontier cabin. The math did not lie. It was an engineering triumph of heat retention over brute force consumption. The Great Arctic Outbreak of 1878 raged for 8 relentless days, becoming one of the longest cold snaps in early Montana history. When the weather finally broke on December 29th, the relief across the settlement was tempered by the severe toll the storm had taken. Families emerged from their homes exhausted, low on fuel, and facing a long winter with depleted wood supplies. Dutch Henry's substantial log cabin had consumed over 4 full cords of seasoned timber in a single week, a staggering volume of wood that had taken weeks of backbreaking axe work to cut, haul, and stack. Several smaller homesteads down Tenderfoot Creek had burned through their entire winter reserves, leaving them dangerously vulnerable to the cold months still ahead. Abselum Winters, on the other hand, had burned roughly 60 pounds of small wood over those same 8 days. He had used less fuel during a historic killer blizzard than his neighbors consumed during a mild autumn afternoon. As news of Grant's visit spread through the territory, word traveled faster than the cold wind. What had started as a subject of valley ridicule suddenly transformed into an intense curiosity among local builders, trappers, and miners. Samuel Grant, completely converted from a vocal skeptic into a passionate observer, decided to turn the winter of 1878 and 1879 into a rigorous scientific experiment. He made regular trips up to the hillside shelter throughout January and February, carrying his mercury thermometer and a wooden balance scale to record precise comparative data between Winters' dugout, Dutch Henry's log home, and 2 other standard cabins in the region. The records preserved by Grant revealed thermal performance metrics that shattered every established assumption about frontier architecture. During periods of moderate winter cold, when outdoor temperatures fluctuated between 0 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit, Winters maintained interior room temperatures between 65 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. To achieve this, he burned an average of 4 2/10 pounds of seasoned pine per day. Down in the valley, Dutch Henry's traditional log home required 32 pounds of similar timber per day just to keep the hearth area between 58 and 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Furthermore, the far corners of Dutch Henry's cabin regularly measured in the low 40-degree range, creating severe temperature imbalances within the same room. Here's the thing about traditional log cabins that frontier builders rarely factored into their designs: air stratification. In an above-ground cabin with 6-foot or 8-foot timber walls and a vaulted roof, heat naturally rises to the ceiling, where it serves no human purpose. The air near the ceiling might reach 80 degrees Fahrenheit, while the floor air where people sit and sleep remains hovering near 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The radiant heat from a standard open fireplace travels in a straight line, warming only the objects directly in front of the flames, while doing nothing to warm the surrounding air volume. In winter shelter, the structural geometry worked in perfect harmony with the laws of thermal physics. Because the ceiling sloped downward toward the short front wall, the upper air volume was tightly restricted. Heat could not stack up uselessly out of reach. More importantly, the 2,800 pounds of dense sandstone lining the rear wall emitted radiant infrared heat. Unlike hot air, which quickly rises and escapes through cracks, radiant heat directly warms the physical surfaces in a room: the stone floor, the wooden furniture, and the human body. The entire room acted as a uniform, radiant enclosure. Grant noted in his logbook that a person sitting in the farthest corner of Winters' dugout experienced the exact same cozy warmth as someone standing directly next to the firebox. The most dramatic contrast between the two building methods occurred on January 27, 1879, when a sudden secondary Arctic surge slammed into northern Montana. Outdoor temperatures crashed to 26 degrees below zero, accompanied by sustained winds of 25 miles per hour. The storm was so severe that 3 trappers stranded in outlying camps succumbed to hypothermia, and livestock losses across the territory exceeded 200 head of cattle. Grant spent that catastrophic afternoon inside Dutch Henry's cabin to observe how a conventional home weathered extreme conditions. Despite Dutch Henry and his sons feeding thick pine logs into their wide stone fireplace until the chimney stones creaked under the heat, the cabin interior could not break above 55 degrees Fahrenheit near the hearth. The massive draft pulled by the wide-open chimney created howling cold drafts under the door and through every dried log seam. Dutch Henry burned 85 pounds of prime firewood in 24 hours, yet his family was forced to wear heavy winter coats inside their own living room. Later that evening, Grant trekked up the mountain to check on Winters. Inside the dugout, the air sat at a steady, comfortable 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Winters had burned just 6 pounds of wood all day. The stone heat battery behind the firebox was performing flawlessly, absorbing high-temperature energy from small, rapid burns and slowly releasing it over 12-hour cycles. The secret lay in what modern thermodynamic engineers call thermal inertia. When a material like sandstone is brought up to temperature, its dense mass resists rapid temperature fluctuations. While an above-ground timber wall loses its heat to the cold wind within minutes after a fire goes out, high-mass stone wrapped in deep clay insulation retains its thermal energy for days. The earth surrounding 3 sides of Winters' dugout acted as an infinite thermal flywheel. Because the earth 12 feet below the surface never drops below 45 degrees Fahrenheit, the ambient ground actively prevented the shelter from ever falling into freezing territory, even if the firebox was left cold for a week. Grant's meticulous records proved that Winters had achieved an astonishing 87% reduction in wood consumption compared to the best conventional log home in the region. Over the 5-month period from November 1878 through March 1879, Dutch Henry burned approximately 12 cords of timber, representing roughly 960 cubic feet of dense, split wood. That required nearly a month of hard manual labor, multiple draft horses, and endless hauling. Abselum Winters burned 1 cord and 40 additional cubic feet of wood over the exact same 5-month period, a total of roughly 168 cubic feet of timber. He had cut his seasonal firewood supply in just 2 days, using nothing more than a handsaw and a light wood cart. As the long winter began to give way to the early thaws of March 1879, the initial skepticism that had greeted Winters' excavation was completely gone. In its place was a quiet, profound realization among the frontier community. The old trapper had not merely survived the winter. He had lived in effortless, superior comfort while consuming a tiny fraction of the resources his neighbors had exhausted. Sit with that reality for a moment. A solitary 64-year-old man, equipped only with a pickaxe, a shovel, and an understanding of natural physics, had outperformed the collective building wisdom of 2 generations of frontier carpenters. He had proven that brute material consumption was no substitute for smart, climate-adapted engineering. The question that kept troubling Samuel Grant as he reviewed his journal entries was simple yet profound. Where had an uneducated mountain trapper learned such sophisticated thermodynamic principles? As the snow melted along Tenderfoot Creek, Grant began spending long evenings by Winters' firebox, determined to uncover the historical roots of this lost engineering knowledge. Over the remaining weeks of that winter, as the harsh winds began to soften along the Tenderfoot Creek drainage, Samuel Grant spent hours sitting in the quiet warmth of Abselum Winters' dugout. He wanted to know how a solitary hunter possessed knowledge that completely outclassed the established practices of American frontier carpenters. What Winters revealed during those late-night conversations was not a sudden personal invention, but rather a convergence of 2 distinct, ancient building traditions that industrial frontier culture had foolishly dismissed as primitive. Abselum Winters had been born in 1814 in rural New York State. At the age of 19, drawn by tales of vast mineral wealth, he traveled west to Michigan's Upper Peninsula during the early copper mining boom. Working deep underground in the iron and copper shafts, he labored alongside Finnish immigrants who had brought centuries of Scandinavian building wisdom across the Atlantic Ocean. These miners laughed at the American settlers who cut down vast forests to construct drafty, above-ground timber houses. The Finns built low to the ground, excavating into south-facing hillsides whenever possible, and insulating their roofs with thick sod and turf. During the horrific winter of 1843, when severe blizzards choked supply lines and wood shortages caused several deaths in the Michigan mining camps, Winters had sheltered inside an earth-banked house constructed by a Finnish family. He experienced firsthand how a structure built two-thirds below grade maintained stable, livable temperatures through 3 weeks of Arctic cold, consuming nothing more than small bundles of pine kindling while log cabin dwellers froze in their beds. The second piece of the puzzle came 9 years later, in 1852, when Winters traveled north into Saskatchewan to trap fur with a Cree community. There he observed winter lodges built with deep earth banking and specialized heat management systems. The Cree had perfected thermal engineering over hundreds of generations in one of the unforgiving climates on the continent. They understood that attempting to heat raw airspace was a fool's errand. Instead, they heated high-mass stones during the day, banked their coals, and allowed the dense rocks to radiate soft, continuous warmth through the Arctic night. They knew how to position fire pits low in the earth, how to manipulate chimney draft without massive stone stacks, and which specific river rocks held thermal energy without cracking. Winters combined the structural earth sheltering of the Finns with the high-mass radiant heat management of the Cree. When he arrived in Montana in 1876, and saw settlers building large, drafty log cabins with towering open fireplaces, he recognized the exact same wasteful mistakes he had witnessed 30 years earlier in Michigan. He saw men fighting against the winter with brute force and endless timber consumption rather than working alongside the thermal physics of the earth. Truth be told, this revelation deeply troubled Samuel Grant. As a master mason who had spent his life building conventional stone fireplaces and timber frames, he was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The methods that American frontier culture considered advanced were actually inefficient and wasteful, while the techniques they dismissed as crude or primitive were demonstrably superior in every measurable way. If you are enjoying this deep dive into lost frontier history and vernacular engineering, take a second right now to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to uncovering authentic, battle-tested survival knowledge that actually worked when modern technology did not exist. Drop a comment below telling us if you would ever build an earth-sheltered structure on your property, and let us keep this vital historical wisdom alive. As spring arrived in April of 1879, and the frozen ground finally softened enough for digging, a quiet architectural revolution began along Tenderfoot Creek. Samuel Grant became the very first convert. Abandoning his conventional log house, he selected a south-facing slope 3 miles west and began constructing a new home based entirely on Abselum Winters' specifications. Grant excavated 11 feet deep into the clay slope, creating a compact living space of roughly 780 cubic feet. He installed a heavy sandstone heat battery weighing 2,400 pounds behind an offset firebox, complete with a serpentine smoke flue. Grant documented every step of his building process with meticulous precision, producing what was likely the first written technical manual for earth-sheltered frontier dwellings in the Montana Territory. His notebook preserved detailed measurements, soil selection guidelines, and stone masonry specifications that laid the groundwork for future builders. By October of 1879, Grant's new earth shelter was complete. The ultimate test came just 2 months later, during a sharp cold snap in late December when outside temperatures plunged to 22 degrees below zero. Inside his new dugout, Grant recorded a comfortable room temperature of 67 degrees Fahrenheit while burning roughly 5 pounds of split pine per day. His old log cabin, which he had left standing nearby as a control model, required 40 to 50 pounds of wood per day to maintain an interior temperature that barely reached 50 degrees near the hearth. As word of Grant's success spread along the trading routes, other frontiersmen took notice. In the summer of 1880, a Norwegian trapper named Olaf Bergstrom, working the cold drainages north of Fort Benton, built an earth shelter, incorporating both Winters principles and traditional Norwegian turf house concepts. Bergstrom introduced a brilliant design modification. He constructed a raised timber sleeping platform positioned 4 feet above the floor, directly over the sandstone heat battery. Because warm air naturally collects in the upper portion of a low room, sleeping directly above the stone mass allowed him to rest comfortably, without blankets even during sub-zero nights. Even Dutch Henry, the veteran builder who had initially mocked Winters as a senile fool, quietly surrendered to reality. In the autumn of 1880, Henry began excavating his own winter dugout on a hillside behind his main log house. While he refused to publicly admit that he was copying the old trapper, his design featured every core element of Winters' blueprint: deep earth excavation, compact room volume, heavy sandstone thermal mass, and thick clay wall insulation. Dutch Henry added his own practical refinement to the design by constructing a small, enclosed entryway anteroom that functioned as a cold trap. This secondary doorway created an airlock, preventing icy wind from rushing into the main living chamber whenever someone entered or exited the shelter. By 1882, the Territorial Surveyor's Office in Helena began officially recording earth-sheltered dugouts with increasing frequency. A local survey conducted that year identified at least 23 earth-sheltered homes within a 100-mile radius of Tenderfoot Creek, with dozens more scattered across remote mountain valleys. As different builders adopted the technology, new structural innovations emerged. A German immigrant named Friedrich Kohler engineered a passive ventilation flue that provided continuous fresh air circulation without creating cold floor drafts. A former ship carpenter named Thomas Webb introduced curved timber arch supports that distributed the weight of the heavy dirt roof far more effectively, allowing for wider interior living spaces without compromising structural safety. Perhaps most importantly, indigenous elders began sharing additional refinements with settlers who were finally humble enough to listen. A Blackfeet elder named Many Horses taught several local trappers how to treat raw clay walls with a mixture of rendered animal fat and ash, creating an impenetrable waterproof seal that prevented groundwater from seeping into dugouts during the spring thaw. The economic and survival impact of this architectural shift was extraordinary. Families who had previously spent 4 to 6 full cords of wood every winter, representing months of exhausting labor and dangerous exposure, found their fuel consumption dropping by more than 75%. The hundreds of hours saved from cutting and hauling timber could be redirected towards stockpiling food, tending livestock, and preparing for spring planting. Furthermore, because these high-mass stone heat batteries held warmth for 12 to 15 hours without attention, families no longer suffered from cold nighttime temperature crashes or the constant threat of chimney fires caused by roaring, over-fired hearths. To be sure, cultural pride remained a powerful obstacle for many settlers. A significant portion of homesteaders continued to view earth shelters as crude or socially inferior, preferring to burn through mountains of firewood in cold log cabins, rather than live in a dwelling that resembled an indigenous lodge or a sod house. Other settlers attempted to build dugouts without understanding the underlying physics, omitting the heavy sandstone thermal mass, or failing to construct proper perimeter drainage, and then blamed the concept when their unheated dugouts became damp and cold. However, among those who prioritized practical survival and thermal performance over social appearance, the earth-sheltered movement grew rapidly. By 1885, an estimated 60 to 70 earth-sheltered winter homes were operating in northern Montana alone, with similar structures appearing across Wyoming, Idaho, and the Dakota territories. Abselum Winters, now in his late 70s, lived quietly in his hillside shelter, offering free advice and structural guidance to anyone who asked. He asked for no money, requiring only that people respect the power of the natural earth before attempting to build against it. He had built a small timber cabin for summer use, but every October, as the first frosts dusted the mountain peaks, he returned to his earthen dugout to spend the winter in comfortable, effortless warmth. The ultimate trial of this vernacular engineering revolution was about to arrive. In the late months of 1886, a winter descended upon the American West, so historically catastrophic that it would forever alter the geography of the frontier. The winter of 1886 and 1887 descended upon the American West with a fury that transformed the geography of the northern plains forever. Historians would later call it the Great Die-Up or the Hard Winter. Beginning with relentless blizzards in late autumn, Arctic air masses surged down from Canada, pushing temperatures to -40, -50, and in some high basins, nearly 60 degrees below zero. Howling gales drove snow into mountainous drifts that buried entire ranch houses to their rooftops. Across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakota Territories, hundreds of thousands of cattle froze to death where they stood in the open snow. The open-range livestock industry was completely decimated, bankrupted in a single season. Down in the timbered valleys, conventional homesteaders faced a terrifying life-or-death crisis. As the relentless cold stretched on for weeks, wood supplies dwindled to nothing. Families were forced to burn their wooden fences, farm implements, and eventually their own furniture just to keep their open fireplaces burning. Many settlers abandoned their claims entirely, while others froze to death inside drafty log homes as their hearths went cold. Yet scattered across the territory, the families living in earth-sheltered dwellings weathered the historic catastrophe with fuel to spare. Samuel Grant recorded in his detailed daily journals that his dugout consumed 68% less timber over that horrific winter than his original cabin would have required. More importantly, when late winter blizzards made stepping outside for firewood impossible for 3 consecutive days, his 2,400-pound sandstone heat battery carried his family safely through the storm. While cold winds howled across the frozen landscape, the thermal energy stored deep within his stone walls kept his home comfortably warm. The hard winter of 1886 served as the final, irrefutable vindication of Abselum Winters' vision. The old hunter had not relied on luck or expensive technology. He had relied on an unyielding understanding of natural physics, combining indigenous thermal wisdom and Scandinavian vernacular architecture to create a shelter that worked in harmony with the earth. Abselum Winters passed away peacefully in the spring of 1889 at the age of 75, sleeping inside the very hillside shelter he had excavated 11 years earlier. He died as he had lived warm, comfortable, and completely independent of the resource-heavy systems that plagued his contemporaries. His earth shelter remained fully functional for another 2 decades, serving as a reliable haven for passing trappers, prospectors, and travelers until around 1910, when the regional fur trade collapsed and the area depopulated. Even then, the structure collapsed not from engineering flaws, but simply because time moved on. The heavy sandstone heat mass, the thick earthen walls, and the fundamental thermal battery remained structurally sound after 30 years of relentless mountain winters. Today, more than 100 years later, modern engineers, off-grid builders, and architects are rediscovering the exact same principles that Abselum Winters demonstrated on that frozen Montana hillside in 1878. Modern earth-bermed homes, subterranean shelters, passive solar designs, and thermal mass heat storage systems utilize identical physics. By surrounding living quarters with heavy earth insulation and using dense stone batteries to absorb high-temperature energy from efficient heat sources, contemporary builders regularly achieve 70 to 90% reductions in heating costs compared to standard above-ground houses. The ultimate takeaway of Abselum Winters' story is not merely about construction techniques or thermodynamic math. It is a profound lesson about the danger of cultural arrogance and the priceless value of traditional wisdom. When we dismiss ancient or alternative building methods simply because they appear primitive or differ from conventional practices, we often reveal our own ignorance rather than superior knowledge. The natural earth offers continuous temperature stability and immense heat storage capacity. These are unchangeable physical realities. Working alongside these natural principles creates effortless efficiency, while fighting against them through brute force and excessive consumption leads to waste, hardship, and failure. As we look toward an uncertain future where energy grids grow increasingly fragile and heating costs continue to rise, the forgotten secret of the old mountain hunter is more relevant today than ever before. True resilience does not come from complex, high-tech systems that break when you need them most. It comes from understanding basic physical laws, respecting traditional knowledge, and having the humility to learn from those who mastered survival long before us. Before you go, make sure to hit that like button if you found value in this lost piece of frontier history. Subscribe to our channel right now to join our community as we continue to uncover authentic survival wisdom, historical engineering triumphs, and lost self-reliance techniques from an era when failure was not an option. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on Abselum Winters' shelter, and let us know what lost historical technology you would like us to explore next. Please note that this historical narrative is presented strictly for educational, historical, and inspirational purposes. Any modern building project or off-grid construction requires proper structural engineering, local permit compliance, moisture management, and professional consultation. Always prioritize personal safety and structural integrity when building shelter in extreme environments.